Okay, so what if I told you that everything you think you know about human history is just a story? I mean, that's the really provocative idea right at the heart of Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens. This isn't just a book that tells us what happened. No, it goes deeper. It asks us to question the very fabric of our reality. So let's dive into this journey together. We're going to start with our cognitive awakening, then move through the massive agricultural and scientific revolutions. We'll see how humanity somehow became this single, interconnected world, and then finally, we'll take a look at the story. Well, the one we're writing for our own future. You know, Sapiens doesn't really do small. Harari's whole point is that to really understand ourselves, we have to zoom way, way out. He really starts at the very beginning. We're talking the Big Bang. And you might be asking why. Well, it's to show us that in the grand cosmic scheme of things, our entire existence, it's just this tiny, recent spark. It's a pretty humbling way to kick things off, right? So, how did we, this once insignificant species, end up becoming the dominant force on the entire planet? Well, it all kicked off with something called the cognitive revolution. Think about it. For most of our history, we were, well, nothing special. Just another animal trying to get by. But then, around 70,000 years ago, something shifted. We started to tell stories. And these weren't just campfire tales, okay? We're talking about grand, elaborate myths about gods, about nations, about money. And this, Harari argues, is our actual superpower: fiction. The ability to believe in things that aren't real. It's what allowed us to cooperate in massive numbers. And those early hunter-gatherers, the ones we think of as primitive, turns out they were often healthier and maybe even freer than the farmers who came later. But there's always a but, isn't there? There's a darker side to this. As we spread across the globe, we left behind this massive trail of ecological destruction. We wiped out countless species. So yeah, our rise to power, it came at a pretty steep price. And all of this really leads to a huge, profound question for you and for me. Are our lives actually built on objective truths, or are they built on a bunch of stories we've all just kind of agreed to believe? Speaking of stories, one of the biggest ones we ever told ourselves was the story of progress, that things always get better. But our next supposed big leap forward might not have been what it seemed at all. And this brings us to the agricultural revolution. Now, Harari has a pretty provocative name for the agricultural revolution. He calls it history's biggest fraud. And yeah, sure, it allowed our population to explode and it created food surpluses, but it also meant way harder labor, more disease, and the beginnings of a real social inequality. It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? Did we actually domesticate wheat, or did wheat end up domesticating us? So with more food, you get bigger societies. And with bigger societies, well, you need some kind of order. This is where Harari brings in this brilliant concept he calls imagined orders. Think about things like money, laws, nations, right? None of them exist in nature. You can't touch a nation, but we all just agree to believe in them. And these shared stories, they were crucial for organizing ourselves. But they also did something else. They created hierarchies and were used to justify all sorts of inequality. Okay, so to manage these incredibly complex new societies, human memory just wasn't going to cut it anymore. We needed something better. We needed writing. And that, of course, allowed us to build massive empires and civilizations. But Harari constantly reminds us of a pretty harsh reality. History has never been fair. Those hierarchies that still divide us today based on race, gender, class, he argues they aren't natural laws. They're just more stories. Stories we told ourselves for so long that we started to believe they were real. So even with all these new divisions and hierarchies, something else was happening. Humanity started to become more and more connected, and this leads us to the next major phase, the unification of humankind. So how on earth did all these separate cultures start to merge into what looks like a single global civilization? Harari says it comes down to three huge universal forces. First up, money. It's the ultimate system of mutual trust, right? It connects total strangers who don't have to like or even know each other. Then you've got empires. They spread ideas, technology, and laws across huge territories, often, let's be honest, through incredibly brutal force. And finally, you have universal religions, which gave completely different groups of people a shared set of beliefs and a common moral code. So why did these three things, money, empires, and religion, become so successful? Well, according to Harari, the secret sauce is simple. They were adaptable. The systems that actually last aren't the most rigid or the strongest. They're the ones that can bend and change and evolve over time. And it's exactly this capacity for change that set the stage for maybe the most dramatic transformation in all of human history, the scientific revolution. The whole scientific revolution was sparked by one really radical idea, the admission of ignorance. For the first time in history, we collectively said, you know what, we don't know everything. And that's the key. Science isn't really about being certain, it's about being willing to question everything. Now, this new thirst for knowledge, it was totally inseparable from the age of empires. You can't really pull them apart. Science and imperialism, they grew up together. Exploration wasn't just about discovery for its own sake. A lot of the time, it was about conquest. And so the tools of science, things like maps, medicine, and new technology, they also became the tools of domination. This, let's call it a marriage between science and empire, is what forged the modern world we live in. And it basically runs on a few key ideas. You've got the capitalist creed, this almost religious faith in perpetual growth. You have the immense power of industry, which completely remade our relationship with time and energy. And the result of all that? A state of permanent revolution, where the only thing you can really count on is constant change and disruption. So, with all of this unbelievable progress, it leads to maybe the most important question in the whole book. Are we actually any happier now? Harari really challenges this idea that material progress automatically leads to emotional fulfillment. He suggests that maybe, just maybe, happiness has more to do with our expectations than it does with our actual conditions. And that huge question about happiness and progress, it brings us right to our final section, the story that we ourselves are still writing right now. Harari finishes the book with a really provocative look at where we're headed with things like biotech and artificial intelligence. He says we may be on the cusp of literally becoming gods, or we could lose our humanity altogether. The future isn't just unknown, he suggests it might even be unknowable. So in the end, Harari basically holds up a mirror to all of us and asks one final crucial question. What kind of species do we actually want to become? Look, Sapiens is so much more than a history book. It really is a challenge. It's an invitation to examine the myths we live by, the systems we build and uphold, and the futures we dare to imagine. When you boil it all down, from the first cave paintings all the way to computer code, our entire journey has been shaped by the power of stories. And so, we're left with the ultimate question: what story are we going to tell next?